I was walking down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
Folks, Real Deal Neil here, and I'd like to welcome my co-hosts, Matthew Martin and Dr. Timothy Christie. And I'd like to welcome the community and everyone across the nation to our brand new show, NBWA. That's New Brunswickers Who Want Action. Gentlemen, I just want to discuss, before we get into the topics today, why are you doing the show? Why are you doing this?
Oh, plain and simple, needs to be talked about. It's enough of hiding in the background. It's time to bring it to the forefront and talk about it.
That's right. Dr. Christie?
Yeah, well, the way that black issues happen in New Brunswick is they're largely ignored.
Yes.
People in power are not sympathetic to them, largely because they're ignorant. So they might not know exactly what the issues are. So for that reason, I think we need to talk about these things. We need to exploit them. We need to expose some of the systemic issues that are happening right here in New Brunswick. And as all of us remember, during the provincial election, one of the leaders of a different party was arguing that there was no such thing as systemic discrimination in New Brunswick.
Mr. Austin.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I think that we need to correct these misperceptions.
You're right. And I agree with both of those statements. I think it's our job as leaders in the black community to communicate this message to everybody so that no one can say, I don't get it, I haven't heard it. That can't be real, because we're going to be authentic. Our stories are going to be real from New Brunswick, and there's going to be a message to the whole community about systemic discrimination and how it's affecting us and our brethren and sisters, right?
And I want to give a message to our political leaders from the outset.
Yes.
We're going to ram this down their throat.
I agree. That's the job of, I think, a politician, is to hear us, right? And to take action. So I believe it's our job in this show to build a lobby, to build a community of action that will support black, brown, and indigenous folks when it comes to equality. That's what I believe we're here for.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so let's lead in. Again, brand new show, NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action, and that's why we're here. So let's lead into the show. We'd had some discussions earlier this morning about what we would talk about today in our first show. Matthew, you want to lead in?
Yeah, so I was reading some articles, and there's a gentleman, Mr. Francis, out in BC. He was going through a human rights complaint in regards to working in the correctional system, and now he is completely broke through the process. He's lost his house, he's lost everything he's had, and he's still fighting for, his financial compensation from it.
Yeah, Mr. Francis was a correctional officer working in BC, and he was transferred from one area of BC to another. And in this transfer, where he was transferred to, people were calling him the N-word, people were physically assaulting him, and these things were racially motivated. He went to the Human Rights Commission in BC and argued his case, and sure enough, it was found that, yes, you were the victim of racial discrimination. But for him to do that, I think it went from 2004 to present. It took, he sold his house, he has PTSD, and he still hasn't been compensated for what's happened. Yeah. And I think this is a nice connection to New Brunswick, because we have the same problem here.
Yes.
So full disclosure, from my perspective, I'm suing the University of New Brunswick St. John campus for a human rights violation. I've made a formal complaint with the Human Rights Commission that they've violated my human rights through racial discrimination. I made this claim in 2017. And it's now 2020, $40,000 later, and 3 years later, and the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission have not acted on my claim. So we've gone through the entire complaint process. We're at the point where the Human Rights Commission has agreed that an investigation is necessary, and like I said, 3 years and $40,000, and they haven't started their investigation yet. That's full disclosure. My experience with the Human Rights Commission is twofold. So one, going through it as a complainant, as a victim of racial discrimination. But I'm also an academic. And I've studied the commission, I've read all of their annual reports, I've read all of the legislation, I've written a detailed paper on them, and part of what we'll do today is talk about the incompetence of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission and the complete inadequacy of the New Brunswick Human Rights Act.
And I'll just connect with that. Again, I know that Mr. Levon Francis out in BC, you know, it's a whole other province away, and we discussed this earlier this morning, but yet here you are in New Brunswick experiencing a similar response from the Human Rights Commission, especially when it comes to your financial outlay, right, and the work that you've had to do to prove your case. And, you know, look, Tim, you've said it a million times, I want to burn this mother down. And I never believed it. I never agreed with it. But after you and I spoke about your case, and then I looked at Mr. Francis's case, and I remember the quote you gave me. You said, every system is designed to perfectly create the outcome that it wants.
Exactly.
And look, being a lawyer, I've always believed in the Human Rights Commission and the Act and the legislation, never having had to really employ it in the process of litigation, right? I just took for granted and assumed that it was a righteous piece of legislation there to protect me, you, and the others, right? But now I'm looking across the country at the outcomes, and they're all the same. People are going to the commission looking for help and coming out of it broke or broken because of the process, and not receiving their compensation or not receiving a true remedy.
Yeah.
And so back to what I was saying, you were saying forever, you know, we need to burn this legislation down. I agree, but I'll say we need to completely revamp that process, that structure, so that it works for us and not makes us broken,
right,
trying to prove our the righteousness of our claim. Saying.
I think currently, I think it's one of those systems that is perfectly designed for the outcomes it has, and right now, you know, in your example as well as Mr. Francis, you see that it's perfectly designed to leave the complainant broken. You know, instead of, you know, I was reading as well, it's already been proven that that his claim is necessary.
Evidence.
He was deemed in his workplace as a troublemaker for wanting equal rights for black workers. So my thought is that if he's a troublemaker, then what are we? But then to even his lawyers reached out. He's a man who's broken, no home now. They reached out and said, since, you know, it's already agreed that he's entitled to some financial compensation, can we speed up that process? And they've said no. We still have to let it take its time. So here now, our system that has already said you're in the right is now delaying his financial compensation even more and affecting his way of life continuously now.
So Neil, I'm not going to talk about the details of my specific case. What I want to do is talk more generally. So I've been very public about my case. It's published in many places. But what I want to talk about is some of the specific problems with the New Brunswick human rights approach.
Let's go.
So
Again.
I have 3 main points I want to make. The first point is that the Human Rights Commission is not only completely ineffective and unproductive, but incompetent. And I will talk about why I think they're incompetent and completely ineffective and very unproductive. But more fundamentally, more importantly, the 2 issues with the New Brunswick Human Rights Act are, the first thing is that it puts the entire onus on the victim of racial discrimination.
It's reverse burden, I agree.
So the person who suffers racial discrimination has to initiate the complaint, navigate the entire complaint process, and if they don't have the legal skills to do that themselves, they have to hire a legal team to do that. Other crimes, and we'll talk about this, the victim of other crimes does not have to navigate the process. The state does that for them.
That's right.
So this is one of the fundamental problems with the New Brunswick human rights approach, is that the state has washed its hands of responsibility to advocate for the rights of individuals and put that that onus on the victim. And then the second thing, or the third thing, is that even if the victim manages to navigate the entire process, has the financial resources or the education to get through it, the legal education or expertise to get through it, the perpetrator, the racist, the person who's committed the act of racial discrimination does not suffer any criminal sanctions. They might receive a little fine, and they might be required to make the victim whole, so you might have to compensate them.
I will just digress momentarily. There is an opportunity for a perpetrator under the Provincial Offences Procedures Act to go to jail for 90 days. I could not find any evidence of that ever happening.
It hasn't happened.
But it is in the legislation. But we've already talked about the
But,
gatekeepers to that.
Yeah, but this is my point, is that the legislation itself is a paper tiger. And theoretically, it works perfectly.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I will defy anyone to show me a racist in New Brunswick who goes to jail for being racist.
You
They
won't find it.
You
I
won't
agree.
find it.
And you won't find anyone who's received the maximum fine of $15,000. Look, I'm with you. I see the paper dragon in the Human Rights Act, okay, the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, and then they perpetrate it further by saying, don't worry, there are remedies, there are punishments under the Provincial Offences Procedures Act, but they even have gatekeepers. I can't bring a human rights prosecution unless it's under the before the Labor and Employment Board. So that's a bookend. That's not racial discrimination on the street, right? And I have to get permission from the Attorney General to do that. So I don't remember in my criminal law experience ever having to do those things, right? The prosecution team, they make the prosecutions happen without
and
any
the point
of those.
is, the legal lawyers are very good at explaining the minutia of this legislation. And I'm not interested in the minutia of the legislation. It's not going to get there.
It's not working.
It's never going to get there.
Yeah.
The commission itself, last year, it processed a very, very small fraction of the cases that it had open. I think the number was 14%.
How many of those were racial discrimination?
Very few. Very few. So the numerator-denominator ratio of racial discrimination cases in front of the Human Rights Commission is very low. They weed a lot of them out at the beginning. So the commission, it is very unproductive. It doesn't solve cases. It spends most of its time finding reasons to dismiss cases. So if you look at the facts, about 60% of the complaints that come to the commission are abandoned or dismissed for a legal technical reason, or it's past the statute of limitations, so it's outside of a window. There are a lot of legal technical reasons why these cases are dismissed. Once again, the victims of racial discrimination, however, might not have the legal skills or the experience to understand that there is a legal process you have to go through. And that's why usually with other crimes, we have the state that does this for us.
That's right. The state is in the best position.
Exactly. But even more importantly, though, take the commission out of it. Like I said, I want to say publicly, they're incompetent. They do not do a good job. They're completely unproductive. They're very unproductive and ineffective at helping people that are victims of racial discrimination. But the reverse onus that the victim suffers is really important to discuss, and maybe we can talk about that in a little bit of detail. But if I'm the victim of another crime, I can call the police and say, I've been the victim of a crime. So someone stole from me, someone punched me in the nose, my car is missing, my house is burned down, whatever the crime is that I've suffered, I can call the police and the police will actually conduct an investigation. If they have reasonable and probable cause, they will go and arrest that person. After they've arrested the person, they will interrogate the person, they'll conduct an investigation, and then they'll talk to the Crown and see if they need to press charges against the person. Then the Crown will proceed with charges and prove the case. This is all following the principles of fundamental justice, all the procedural justice principles, presumption of innocence, and all of that stuff. But this is what the state does to help protect citizens against crime. If you're the victim of racial discrimination, which is a crime, you don't have that option. You cannot call the police. The police will not arrest anyone for committing racial discrimination. The police will not interrogate them. The police will not conduct an investigation, and the Crown will not support you. Your only option is to go through the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission.
And even then, as I said, the process is bookended. You can go through the commission, but it has to fit, obviously, in the enumerated grounds of discrimination listed in our act. And then, as I said, you still got to go through another hurdle.
That's right. And even ending up at the Labor and Employment Board, say I'm the victim of police harassment because I'm black. What is the Labor and Employment Board going to do for me?
Nothing. But a prosecution team there needs to be a finding of guilt by the Labor and Employment Board before it can even get in front of a prosecutor.
Exactly.
What the heck?
Exactly.
That's definitely outside the criminal process, which I think is simpler.
Well, and if we use an example, look at the Fishing and Wildlife Act.
Yeah, we've talked about
Right?
this.
If I go fishing illegally in New Brunswick, or if I go hunting illegally in New Brunswick, the police can stop me, detain me, confiscate my vehicle, arrest me, put me in jail, give me a fine. You cannot be arrested, put in jail, or have your property confiscated for racial discrimination in New Brunswick. I think that is a clear, blatant example of systemic discrimination, that our system is designed to make it so that victims of racial discrimination have no real recourse. The last thing I want to say on that issue is, if you actually get to the point where you prove racial discrimination has happened, there is very little that happens to the racist. They probably will not go to jail. They will not have a criminal record. And this
May not even have a fine.
Might not even have a fine. And this is really important. So say the racist is a professor or a doctor or a clergyman or someone in a position of power in our society. We don't want racists in those positions of power.
That's right.
But the Human Rights Act allows them to behave as racist, engage in racial discrimination, and maintain their position of power in society. And then we say there's no such thing as systemic discrimination if we have racists in positions of power in society. That's an example, because they can exercise their discretionary authority to engage in racial discrimination. If they had a criminal record, they wouldn't be able to maintain those positions. They would have to limit their employment options and no longer be allowed to be in positions of power in a society.
So let's get some input from Mr. Martin. Matthew, you know, Dr. Christie has really laid it out for you.
Yep.
So give us some Cole's notes on your thoughts.
You know, it makes me think back to when the Black Lives Matter marches were happening. There was an incident that happened in Moncton.
That's right.
Where a gentleman was yelling profanities, yelling the N-word at the pass-buyers.
Throwing things at them.
Throwing things at them, and the cops showed up because, you know, they showed up because it was just like a public nuisance. So they came in, told him cease and desist due to a public nuisance, not because he was actually hurling objects. It was just saying racial slurs. They came because it's a public nuisance. They then forth, there was a petition going around saying like the individual should at least have to face, you know, some type of, you know, racial education. At this point, right now, I'm not 100% where that stands, but to say the police came to this situation where they knew what was happening, it was on video, and they came and it's a public nuisance, you need to stop. Not because you're actually, you know, it's just mind-boggling.
That shows what the establishment's perspective is on racial discrimination.
Well, let's look at an establishment perspective, being that we're pushing through the show here. We had a local example of the establishment systemic discrimination against a professional. That was Dr. Angola in Campbellton. Now, I'm only saying this because I lived there and I feel for him. But when I lived in Campbellton, I felt it was really odd that there were so many black surgeons and doctors in Campbellton, because I'm from New Brunswick, or from St. John, and I had never seen so many black doctors in one place. But specific to what happened with Dr. Angola in COVID-19, you want to lead in on that and have this discussion? Because I think this is one of the grossest examples of systemic discrimination I've seen in New Brunswick in a while.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So kind of lay the concrete groundwork for anybody who doesn't know. The Cliff Notes here. Dr. Angola traveled over to Quebec to pick up his daughter for whatever reasons they may have been. He then returned back to New Brunswick without self-isolating. I've heard mixed reports myself that he was told he didn't have to self-isolate. You know, some people say yes, he would have had to. At the time, the Emergency Act said you needed to self-isolate if you left the province. Now I've heard that he was told that he did not have to, which is funny because they've also brought to light that currently in the Campbellton region, if you lived in Maine or Quebec and you were coming into the province to work at the hospital, you actually didn't have to self-isolate, which makes me believe that it was probably true that he did not have to self-isolate because of that kind of rule that was put in place. You know, there's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of hearsay, but I think what wasn't hearsay is the hatred that was put on social media on an open platform for anybody to read.
I saw a lot of that.
You know, telling him, go back to where you came from.
Yeah.
We might as well string you up by a noose and drag you back across the border. Just blatant racism.
Lynch him.
Yeah.
Now, what surprises me is, notwithstanding this doctor's human rights and notwithstanding that the Emergencies Act was in place, was how they treated him without any evidence. So immediately he was fired or
Suspended.
He was immediately suspended with zero evidence. And what also surprised me, and it's quite typical of political figures to do so, is Mr. Higgs came out and made some comment in the media about this doctor not having any investigative information. And he just blatantly made statements which he could not back up about this doctor.
He explained how irresponsible the doctor was.
Yeah. Basically, we painted him, as you just said, as this irresponsible doctor who has, put the province at risk, basically blaming him for any new outbreaks in the area with no backup. That was my challenge. He had no evidentiary backup for his statements.
And if we look at that, just from an ethical perspective, medical confidentiality is one of the most important promises we give our patients.
That's right.
Within hours of his diagnosis, his confidentiality was breached from several ways. The Premier's comments, everyone will be very careful to say the Premier did not mention his name. The Premier didn't say who it was. But the Premier provided enough information for this individual to be re-identified. So when you can take several sources of information, combine them together to identify a patient, this is a breach of confidentiality.
And it's Campbellton. The minute the investigation began with him, I can assume like everybody knew. The neighbors knew, and then it was like they told two friends and they told two friends. Again, having lived there, small town, and it's even smaller for black folks.
I think one of the more disturbing things as well is the mayor of Campbellton.
Yes.
But she came on and she said that the people in Campbellton are not racist, that this doesn't represent her community, and that the people in Campbellton were made aware that COVID was in their community, and they naturally became scared. And sometimes
it naturally brought out the worst.
Brought out the worst in the community.
And I believe, because I gotta just be real, I saw the interview and she said, well, it was fear and it naturally brought out the worst in people. That's how racism starts. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
She was shrugging just like that.
Yeah, she was like, well, no biggie.
So I would like to explain to the mayor that the proper thing for one of our leaders to do in our community would be to condemn that type of behavior.
Absolutely.
Say, no, we do not want to lynch our doctors here. No, we do not want to string them up and drag them across a bridge. No, that type of sentiment from our community is completely inappropriate.
Right.
She did not say that.
She did none of that.
No.
The challenge to her is, why didn't you say that?
Yeah. Why
Instead
did you
of
not
explaining
condemn the racism?
away, condoning racism, explaining why people did it and how it's naturally understandable.
Absolutely.
Why didn't she come out and say this is intolerable? And once again, when you have people in these positions of power that maintain these racist attitudes and give people permission and apologize for them and explain away their behavior, this is what's fostering the underbelly of systemic discrimination.
Okay, so before we close out this first edition of NBWA, I want to just go around. Mr. Martin, closing thoughts on our discussion this afternoon.
I think I just wanted my closing remarks to be in regards to Dr. Angola. I think it's, in regards to the whole situation, the Fifth Estate did an investigation into it, and they tracked every single one of his footsteps, everybody he came in contact with, all of which came back negative for the virus, and they've even said that his chances of being patient zero for the re-outbreak was highly unlikely. So, we go back to, there was never a investigation done, and they already put the blame on this doctor purely for the fact that he left the province. There's a lot of other situations that I'd like to speak about, but we're closing. But other people are exempt from this and are allowed to intermingle within society. It's already been shown now that it was probably very highly unlikely, and that other folks within the environment were more likely to have caused the outbreak.
Right. Mr. Christie, really quickly, because we've got to wrap it up here.
Yeah, two things. One on the Angola thing. It shows how the community tolerate these immigrants and people of color in their community. They tolerate us by a thread. And the second that thread becomes inconvenient, we see how quickly they cut it with Dr. Angola. I think that behavior is unforgivable, and I think the mayor needs to apologize to all of us for the way she responded to those comments. The second thing is with racial discrimination in New Brunswick. I'm not going to give up on this, but it needs to be not only a punishable offense, it needs to be a crime in the Criminal Code of Canada, where if I'm the victim of racial discrimination, I can call the police, and the police treat it like they do any other crime.
Who doesn't want to be able to get some justice when you're standing on King Street in St. John and some hillbillies drive by screaming, pardon me? Who doesn't want some justice, right?
And what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is the medium isn't the message, we're the message. We are here to tell the stories to our community and to ensure that our perspective is shared. I agree, I think you agree with that. And I think that this television show, this opportunity is of such importance that we need to be here every week sending this message out. It makes me angry to know that people of power, as you said, our council's all white, the police board's all white, the government's all white, the mayor and council in Campbellton's all white, and it's all these white people telling us what we're supposed to be doing. I don't agree. I think as a community we have to come together and be stronger, and the only way that we can get our message out, I believe, at least in this province, is through this show. Matthew, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're the president of BLM, and I know that's not your role here, right? You're a co-host on this show that's going to give out the message, but maybe we can next week dig in a little bit to BLM Canada in the context of BLM USA.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people don't realize, especially on behalf of Black Lives Matter New Brunswick, there's a lot of things that we do very differently than the States, and I think that's something that we should discuss, have it in the open so people understand the perspective of where Black Lives Matter New Brunswick as an organization is coming from.
Which I agree would be very different than what we're seeing in the 24/7 news cycle down in the States.
Absolutely.
Right? Christie?
However, I want to mention I am very sympathetic to the 24-hour news cycle in the States with what Black Lives Matter is saying. And I read a quote recently where it said, protests should not turn violent and arrests should not turn into murder.
Absolutely.
That's right. That's
so
right.
I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the causes that are happening right now.
So, Mr. Martin, I want to thank you. Welcome back to the show for helping me co-host today. I appreciate it. Dr. Christie, I also appreciate you coming in and helping me host the show today. And I want to thank you for tuning in to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. And I want to welcome you back next week, too, because we're going to be here laying it out, communicating our message. And I want to thank you for your time.